Your paper, German Views on US Nuclear Weapons in Europe, Public and Elite Perspectives, suggests that German public and elite support for withdrawing US nuclear weapons from Germany is high, especially framed within a broader arms control sequence. Do you think that such withdrawal could unintentionally revive pressure for a Eurobomb by creating perceived deterrence vacuum in Europe, particularly if arms control reciprocity from Russia fails to materialize?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me. So when we did that research together with my colleague Michal Smetana, this was the first wave of data collection happened before the war before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. And I mean, what we have seen in the meantime is quite fundamental reshaping of the deterrence landscape in Europe, but also how Europeans think about deterrence. We have published also subsequently other papers, and I published also alone, that there has been a sort of growing support for nuclear deterrence in Europe. That, of course, has sort of ebbed and flowed over time, but one of the things that we see is that the Europeans are becoming more and more aware that nuclear deterrence matters. And therefore, I suspect that if the United States were to decide tomorrow or next year to withdraw the nuclear weapons from Germany, even if it were in the context of arms control, I think people would look very, very closely at the fine print of this arms control and of this arms control agreement. And there would be, of course, some that would sort of call for some sort of national deterrence measures. It's hard to predict at this moment how exactly would those national deterrence measures look like, but I do predict that what could happen is that there would be a pressure to either some sort of fast-track cooperation with France or some sort of European coordination and cooperation. And one cannot expect that there would be also calls for a national nuclear deterrent. And national nuclear deterrent remains a relatively unpopular option in Germany, since you asked about Germany at the beginning, but there are it does remain an unpopular option, but of course the support has increased a little bit over time, and we have seen quite fundamental reshuffling after Donald Trump came into power. We see that on the elite level. We see how people talk about this, but also various disparate public opinion surveys point out that the trust to American guarantee has been declining, and that has been work that my colleague Michal Smetana has been doing with his other collaborators. But we also have seen that how Europeans think about nuclear weapons has changed again after Donald Trump became second-time president.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your point of view. And then I want to ask, could the psychological drivers of an in-group protection, so anger, threat, fear of abandonment, as you mentioned in your research article, Hawks in the Making, European Public Views on Nuclear Weapons Post-Ukraine, make proposal for a Eurobomb even more political feasible, or would they risk deepening division within Europe?
So this is a really good question because I think there are two things that are in play, and the first one is, of course, the demand, and the second one is what kind of specific form would such protection have. And so I think on one hand, when it comes to demand for some sort of nuclear protection, I do think that would increase. However, I think very early on, and I mean it's a debate we can only expect because it hasn't taken really place. One would have to think about how should such protection look like. I often have a really hard time to understand what the notion of a Eurobomb is, but I mean, if you really want to have a European bomb that would have some sort of a joint decision-making mechanism in any shape or form, even similar to nuclear planning group with NATO, That would require us to really change completely the institutional structure of European security. That would require so many changes that I think people would very soon realize that it's too complicated and there might be easier way to do it.
Understandable. So related to the European landscape, do you think Europe can simultaneously strengthen its security posture and remain a credible advocate for nuclear risk reduction, or are these objectives increasingly in tension?
So I do think that the two have always been sort of in tension, right? Because the Europeans have always said we like nuclear non-proliferation. We oppose, we are advocates of nuclear disarmament. We promote the idea of nuclear disarmament, but they have always had this idea that, oh, but let's our nuclear, well, the nuclear weapons within alliance and the German and the British ones, they're important for us for our security reasons. So there was this sort of I think Matthias Spector would call it a hypocrisy. There has been this sort of doublespeak. And that, of course, has become much more problematic. I think the Europeans still deep inside like the idea of risk reduction and arms control. I think they have just become much more realistic about what is possible and what is feasible. We shouldn't really, risk reduction and arms control always involve an element of verification, but there's also an element of trust, at least whether you can, on some fundamental level, trust that the other party is going to work along. It's trust but verify, but there is this element of trust. I think if you look at the political leadership among European countries at this moment, there's simply no idea that they can trust, for instance, Russia. And so in that sense, I think there is this sense of realism that has been sinking in. I think so the Europeans would really like nuclear risk reduction because they do realize that nuclear weapons are dangerous, but they are also realizing that this is not particularly feasible in the short term.
Thank you. And last question. What do you see as the core insecurity driving renewed discussion about European nuclear option? And do you think this insecurity is primarily military, political, or psychological in nature?
It's a fantastic question. And I think especially if you talk about nuclear weapons in Europe, the military and the political is not necessarily always easy to separate. I think if you think about, let's say, if you think about the French sort of nuclear umbrella, the idea that President Macron has been sort of floating around, people have been talking about it. I think there is a fundamental mismatch between what France has been saying for the last 60 years of its nuclear being, which was, this is a national nuclear deterrent that we are going to use in the moment of the fundamental violation of the French sovereignty, and the idea that this should somehow be applicable to a broader European system. And so this sort of reminds you in some ways to the deterrence debates within the NATO alliance in 1950s and 60s, when the Americans would tell the Europeans, you take care of the conventional deterrence, we take care of the nuclear one, and if need be, we come and save you. And this wasn't fundamentally trustworthy, so the Americans had to put some skin in the game. And that is why, for instance, there has been an institutional development, like the development of the nuclear planning group and a stronger embedding of the nuclear angle within NATO, within the alliance. But at the same time, there has been a much stronger development of sort of military element, which is American troops on the ground, military cooperation, military sales, presence of American physical presence in Europe, and so on and so forth. And so these two have been reinforcing mutually the idea that Americans are to be trusted with the nuclear deterrent, and that still remains extremely fragile. Now, if you think about how this works, how this would work with the French nuclear deterrent, we don't have any of this. So we have to start building things like institutional trust, institutional elements, French skin in the game, so a larger French military footprint in Europe, and so on and so forth. So it's possible. It's not going to be quick. It's not going to be cheap. It's not going to be easy.